He had grown used to her silence in their days on the road, a silence that sometimes unnerved him more than 1,000 curses ever could. The Hound, Sandor Clegane, wasn't a man easily frightened, but there was something in the girl's muteness that nibbled at him like a ghost from a past life. She had the look of someone constantly poised between vengeance and flight. More than once, he caught her glaring at him in the dancing shadows cast by campfires. That glare felt like it could come from some old spirit haunting the forests rather than from a small, half-starved girl. He told himself he didn't care. It wasn't his duty to be liked or understood. He was a sellsword in all but name, protecting her more out of some half-formed reason than any real loyalty. She was a hostage to deliver, or perhaps his best chance at a ransom he'd never seen. Some days he reminded himself it was for money. Other days, he told himself it was to keep her from worse fates. Truth be told, he didn't understand why he still had her by his side. But he did, and that was that. Arya Stark had a way of looking at him that made him feel she could see behind every scar on his body, see the twisted flesh beneath the thick armor of cynicism he wore. He hated that, or perhaps he needed it. He wouldn't dwell on it too much. Dwelling on such thoughts was how you ended up as dead as her father, a good man with illusions about honor. The Hound had no illusions anymore. Not about the world, not about the people in it, and certainly not about himself. They were camped just off a narrow dirt road leading northward, near a trickling creek that gave them water to drink and a place to splash away some of the grime. A single, twisted weirwood overshadowed them, its bark ghostly white in the moonlight, its carved face worn away by centuries of wind and rain. The occasional rustle in the undergrowth revealed small nocturnal animals rummaging for food. Arya had volunteered to make the stew tonight, collecting scraps of dried meat and a handful of herbs she'd recognized from her childhood at Winterfell. He watched her, arms folded, towering behind her as though he expected her to slip a dagger in his side at any moment. Her hair was cropped short, dirty brown with an underlayer that still held something of the chestnut hue of the Starks. Her gray eyes were heavier than any child's eyes ought to be. That night, the tensions between them flared in the hush of the forest. After days and days of half-uttered remarks, she finally found her voice. "If I kill you," she said, stirring the pot without looking at him, "no one would ever know." Perhaps she was trying to make a threat. Perhaps she was simply thinking aloud. He didn't respond at first. He eyed her, took a swig from the water skin, and spat some out into the grass, as though testing the water's taste. He made a disgusted face that might have been a smile if one tilted one's head and squinted. He told her that if she tried it, she'd better make sure she did it right the first time, because he'd happily choke the life out of her with his single good hand if it came to that. Neither spoke of it again that evening, but the tension hovered like a dark cloud over the meager firelight. Once the stew was finished, they ate in silence, taking care not to meet each other's eyes. The forest seemed to breathe around them, a hush of wind passing through the weirwood's branches. In that hush, the girl seemed to make a decision. Something flickered across her face. Resolution or regret, it was hard to tell, and then it was gone. She curled up, back to the fire, and tried to sleep. Morning arrived in shades of pink and gold, the sky promising a day too warm for the end of autumn. The Hound yawned, scratched his stubble, and looked around. The girl had risen earlier, as she always did, and was off gathering more water or checking the perimeter for threats. He was never quite sure what she did with her restless energy. He ground his teeth, thinking about how they needed to keep heading north, how every day spent too long in these borderlands meant less of a chance to find her kin, or whoever might pay for her. And each day north reminded him that he was getting nowhere fast. Would her mother pay? Would her brother have paid, if he were still alive? Rumors had it that Robb Stark was dead, that Lady Catelyn was gone, too. Winterfell was a ruin, and the north was scattered. She might have distant cousins somewhere. Did he intend to find them and demand a few coins? It was starting to feel pointless. When Arya returned, she carried 2 dead rabbits by their ears. She never said how she had snared them or where she found them, and he never asked. She was good at surviving. He'd give her that. As she walked past him to gut and clean them, he thought about her family, about how Ned Stark had seemed the picture of honor before he lost his head in King's Landing. He wondered if Ned Stark's spirit stared down at them all now, disappointed in everything he saw. His daughter's traveling companion, the war that ravaged the kingdoms, the monstrous illusions of men in power. The Hound snorted. The girl cut a neat slice down the rabbit's belly. The future stretched out before them both like a dusty road, meandering and uncertain. They set out shortly afterward, not sparing more than a glance backward at the ashes of their small fire. The horse, a rangy mare with a sour disposition, carried the Hound's armor and traveling packs. Arya walked beside, sometimes trailing behind, sometimes loping ahead to scout the road. The day was hot, the sun unrelenting, dust swirling around them. The only relief came when a stray breeze rustled the branches overhead or when a cloud drifted in front of the sun for a few moments, offering a moment's reprieve from the glare. At midday, they paused near a shallow brook. The horse drank greedily, and the Hound knelt to wash the sweat and grime from his scarred face. Arya stood a little distance away, scanning the treeline. It was there, in that hush of midday sun, that her thoughts drifted, and the notion she'd been harboring for a long time took root in her. She'd practiced it in her mind, what it would mean to slip away, vanish like a shadow while he was distracted. He was strong, dangerous, yes, but he was only a man. And Arya Stark had grown used to danger. She'd learned to slip from one identity to another, to fade into the crowd, to fight if she had to. If he truly sought ransom, she might be safer alone. If he wanted to protect her, he never outright said it. She owed him nothing, and he owed her nothing except perhaps more confusion and more bruises on her soul. Still, it was not an easy thing to leave a man like the Hound. She had to be sure. She watched him as he scrubbed the sweat off the back of his neck. The part of his face not covered by the burn scars looked almost human in that moment, almost vulnerable. She wondered if he was tired of the road, tired of her, or just tired of living in a world filled with betrayal. Quickly, she scolded herself for such sentiments. It didn't matter if he was tired. He was a killer. He'd been ready to hand her over to her enemies if it meant gold in his purse. And yet, the memory of his unexpectedly gentle hands when he'd once bandaged her cut elbow flickered through her mind. He'd done it with minimal words, just a grunt and a half-insult, but he'd done it. She drank from the brook, the cold water sharp on her tongue. There was a clearing a short distance away where they could rest the horse in the shade. Once there, the Hound stuffed a crust of bread in his mouth, chewed noisily, and offered the other half to her. She took it more out of habit than gratitude. The dryness of the bread made her throat scratchy, so she washed it down with more water. Then she sat on the ground, knees drawn up, gaze distant. He grunted, "We'll make a few more miles before sundown. Try not to dawdle." She ignored him but rose soon after, following. The rest of the afternoon passed in a slow, grinding pace. The sun began its descent, turning the sky a brilliant orange as it went. They reached a rundown inn, more of a shack really, around dusk. The place smelled of sour ale, moldy straw, and the faint copper tang of old blood. A stable boy with missing teeth took the horse. Inside, a grizzled old proprietor eyed the Hound's scars and Arya's size, then promptly demanded coin for whatever stale offerings he had. They ate a watery soup that tasted mostly of cabbage, shared a piece of black bread, and each took a draught of cheap ale. Arya wrinkled her nose at the bitterness. The Hound gulped his down without comment, though he muttered about the price. In the corner, a group of dirty travelers were tossing dice, their conversation low and secretive. A man with a twisted mustache glanced at Arya with too much interest, but the Hound's glare warned him off. The whole place reeked of desperation, like so many corners of the realm these days. War had turned everyone into half-starved dogs, snapping for scraps. They took a cramped room upstairs, paying extra for a rickety lock on the door. The Hound didn't like sleeping under the same roof as strangers. Too many ways to get robbed or stabbed. But the girl needed rest, and so did he. He lowered himself onto a lumpy straw mattress with a grunt, while Arya took the floor by the window, as far from him as the room would allow. She turned her back to him, dagger clutched against her chest beneath her cloak. Later that night, while the inn was quiet except for the distant snores and the scurrying of rats in the walls, Arya awakened. She looked at the large shape on the bed, listening to his rough breathing, hoping he would not stir. Everything in her tensed. The chamber was dark, illuminated only by the moon's pallid glow that managed to slip through the grimy window. She watched him for a long moment, half expecting him to open his good eye and fix her with that glare. But he did not. His chest rose and fell heavily, and occasionally a soft rasp escaped his lips. She stood slowly, carefully, tucking her dagger in her belt, collecting her small pouch of coins she'd scavenged from pockets and battlefield remains, from the kindness of people who thought her younger or more needy than she was. It wasn't much, but it was something. She took one last long look at the Hound, the man who had seen her at her lowest, the man who had once told her that fear cuts deeper than swords, and who had also told her that one day she'd be strong enough to face it. Or had he? Maybe that was just a memory she'd conjured. Sometimes her memories blurred, mixing the voices of her father, her dancing master, and the Hound into one. She swallowed. The floorboards creaked under her weight, but he did not wake. She edged the door open, stepped into the hallway. A weak lantern flickered at the far end, revealing the scarred walls and low rafters. She inched her way along, praying to the old gods and the knew that no one else was awake to see her slip away. The front door of the inn was barred. She lifted the heavy wooden beam slowly, straining not to make a sound. Her heart thundered in her chest. For a moment, she thought she heard footsteps above her, but when she paused, all was still. With a final heave, she lifted the bar free and placed it carefully against the wall. The door opened onto a silent courtyard. The stable was on her left, overshadowed by the decaying inn. She considered taking the horse, but she knew it was hobbled and saddled with the Hound's gear. She'd have to rummage for the bridle, waste precious moments. And she wasn't a great rider. Besides, they'd noticed the stolen horse immediately, and someone might be paid to track her down. As quietly as she could, she slipped toward the courtyard's gate, stepping over puddles of stale rainwater. The gate creaked, but not loudly enough to rouse the dead. Just beyond it was the road, lit by the moon, empty and somehow inviting in its emptiness. She slipped through and started walking, one step after another, as though stepping into a new life. Beyond the inn, the road curved around a low hill, dense with scraggly pines. She kept off the main track, walking in the taller grass and stepping carefully to avoid snapping twigs that might echo in the night. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled. It filled her with a strange mix of dread and longing. She remembered Nymeria, her lost direwolf, and how she once felt safer with that beast at her side than she ever had with any human companion. The image of Nymeria's golden eyes floated in her thoughts. Perhaps her direwolf still roamed somewhere in these forests. By the time the moon had slid lower in the sky, Arya had put several miles between herself and the Hound. She paused at a small stream to refill her water, splashing it over her face to keep awake. She had no illusions that the separation would be clean. He would discover her gone by morning. He might track her, follow her. She just didn't know. But if he did, she'd figure out a way to run again or to fight. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night's breeze. For all the times she had despised him, traveling with him had become a twisted comfort. Alone, she would have to rely solely on her own wits again, risk being captured by others who might not show her even the vague courtesy the Hound had. But that was the price of freedom, and she would pay it. As she walked deeper into the night, she thought of her list, those names she recited like a prayer each evening before sleep. Now it came back to her, soft as a whisper in her mind. Cersei, Walder Frey, the Mountain, Island Pain, others. The Hound's name had once been on that list. But had she stopped saying his name at some point? So when? She wasn't even certain. But it felt right to leave him behind now to go her own way. And so, she told herself she was free. Morning light found Arya huddled beneath the thick branches of a willow near a stream, her cloak wrapped around her. She woke from a fitful doze, the damp earth clinging to her boots, her shoulders sore from sleeping upright. The slow trickle of the stream reminded her of the morning routine she'd had with the Hound. Searching for water, checking for ambush, dividing rations. Now she was alone. She rubbed the sleep from her eyes and reached for a piece of hard bread from her pouch. It was stale but filling enough. She ate it while thinking about the direction she should take. North was home in theory, but was there a home left? Winterfell had been burned. Sansa was in King's Landing the last she knew, but that felt like ages ago, and a million rumors had traveled across the roads since then. Perhaps she could make for the coast, find a ship. She recalled her short time with that Braavosi dancing master, Syrio Farrell, how he had taught her to move, to see with her eyes. Braavos still lingered in her fantasies. A foreign city, a place of canals and masked men, of Braavos who walked the streets with thin swords at their hips. If she went there, maybe she could hide in the labyrinthine alleys, far from the reach of kings and lords. Or she might try to locate the Night's Watch, find Jon Snow. But the path to the wall was a long one, and it was uncertain if Jon was still there or if he had marched off to some battle. So many questions, so few answers. She eventually decided to keep heading north, at least for a while. Familiar terrain might grant her some advantage if the Hound pursued her. She could evade him better in the forests and hills she knew from childhood stories. So she splashed water on her face, checked that her dagger was secure, and started walking. The road ahead was empty, the morning air crisp. She had to move quickly. If he woke early, he could be on her trail already. Meanwhile, in that rundown inn, the Hound's eyes snapped open to a dull ache in his back. He rolled over on the straw mattress, feeling the slight chill that meant the sun hadn't been up for long. He looked to where the girl had been sleeping. Empty. At first, he merely grunted. It wasn't unusual for her to wake before him. Sometimes she'd go searching for breakfast or for any valuables worth pinching. But then he noticed the dagger was gone from her place by the window, her satchel missing. A sour feeling twisted in his gut. He stood and walked to the window, scanning the courtyard. Her footprints in the dirt floor were faint, but they headed out. He cursed under his breath. He was furious. At her, at himself, at the entire world. Yet, a part of him was not surprised. Of course she'd run. Why wouldn't she? He'd hardly been the epitome of kindness or trustworthiness. But there was that small pang of something he refused to name, a bitterness that she'd do it in the dead of night without a word. He slammed a fist against the wall, startling a rat behind the plaster. Then he gathered his things, strapped on his sword, and stomped downstairs. The old proprietor eyed him warily, as though expecting a beating. The Hound spat on the floor and demanded if the man had seen the girl. The proprietor shrugged, claiming he slept all night, and that if she left, it wasn't his affair. The Hound paid for some half-rotten cheese and left without another word. Outside, the stable boy was asleep in a pile of straw, and the horse was there unsaddled. He saddled it himself, cursing at how the girl had left the horse behind, cursing at how she must think herself so clever. He knew if he wanted to find her, the horse was his best chance. She couldn't have gone too far on foot, especially at night. He had half a mind to let her go, but something in him, pride, anger, or perhaps worry, refused to let the matter rest. He threw the stable boy a copper as he mounted. The boy caught it with a start, stared at it, and scurried out of the way. As Sandor Clegane rode out of the inn's gate, he noticed faint footprints leading north along the edge of the road. The morning sun was climbing, lighting the world in gold. He pressed his heels into the horse's flanks and muttered, "Run all you like, girl. I'll find you." Back on the lonely road, Arya traveled with her senses on high alert. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made her heart jump. She clutched her dagger, cursing that she didn't have a proper sword. Her feet felt heavy from lack of proper rest, but adrenaline kept her moving. For hours, she saw no one. The forest slowly grew denser, the track narrower. At one point, she heard the distant clop of hooves, and she froze, pressing herself against a tree trunk, scanning the area with wide eyes. But the sound faded in another direction. Perhaps it was a hunter or a band of travelers. She waited until she was sure it had passed, then continued on, stepping lightly. In her mind's eye, she could picture the Hound riding after her, murder in his eyes. Would he kill her for running, or just drag her along again? Late in the afternoon, the sun draped the forest in long shadows. She stumbled upon a small homestead, a rickety wooden house, a patch of garden, and a broken fence for livestock. The place seemed deserted, windows shuttered, no smoke rising from the chimney. She approached cautiously, hand on her dagger. The house's door creaked when she pushed it. Inside, a single room greeted her. Dust motes danced in the slanted rays of sunlight. A table and 2 chairs lay overturned. Cabinets were open, their contents ransacked. She saw no sign of recent habitation, only the stale smell of old straw and dried-up vegetable peelings. She guessed that this home had been abandoned months ago, perhaps during one of the raids by passing soldiers. She searched the cupboards, found nothing of use except a chipped clay cup. She picked it up, turning it in her hand, considering if it might be good to carry. But she decided it wasn't worth the space in her meager pack. Then, behind a table leg, she noticed a small rag doll with a missing arm. Her chest tightened. She thought of her younger sister, the way Sansa used to have fancy dolls, though Sansa cared more for her sewing than her toys. Arya always teased her about it. Feeling an ache in her heart, she set the doll aside gently and left the house. Outside, she continued her journey, following a small path behind the house that seemed to lead deeper into the woods. She decided the main road was too risky. If the Hound was trailing her, he'd likely check the main road first. Soon the path was overgrown with ferns and saplings, forcing her to crawl under or around the brambles. Her arms got scratched, her cloak caught on branches. But she pressed on, spurred by a determination born of equal parts fear and longing. Dusk fell, and she found a sheltered spot beneath a rocky overhang. She gathered some fallen branches, built a small fire. She didn't dare make it too large so the light wouldn't carry. The flames danced shadows on the stone. She didn't have much to eat. Another piece of the stale bread, half a handful of berries she'd plucked earlier. Her stomach growled. She remembered the hot bowls of stew the Hound would grudgingly share, the hunts that yielded rabbits or squirrels. She hadn't realized how accustomed she'd become to relying on him for certain things. Now, alone, the fear crept in. She clenched her jaw, determined not to let it overwhelm her. She tried to sleep, but every time she closed her eyes, she imagined footsteps approaching, or the Hound's voice growling her name. She saw faces from her past. Her father's stern but loving look, her mother's worry, her brother's laughter. She missed them so acutely it felt like a physical wound. Eventually, exhaustion claimed her, and she drifted into a restless slumber, dreams haunted by memories of swords and howling wolves. When dawn arrived, gray and cold, she was up before the sun. She doused the tiny fire, brushed away the ashes, then pressed on. She had decided to keep heading north, away from known roads. If she could reach the riverlands or even further, maybe she'd find a safe haven, or at least somewhere the Hound wouldn't think to look. As she walked, the forest seemed to grow thicker, older. The pines were tall and straight, their needles carpeting the ground. Here and there, shafts of morning light pierced the canopy in ghostly columns. That day, she traveled in a tense hush, each step measured. Twice, she thought she heard horses, but each time, the sound faded into the rustle of leaves. She found a bush of wild blackberries, large and ripe. She ate as many as she could, ignoring the thorns that pricked her fingers and lips, reveling in the sweet juice that momentarily eased her hunger. She stuffed more into a makeshift pouch of leaves for later, though they would soon stain through. It was better than starving. She came across no travelers, no villages. The land here bore signs of old conflict, burned-out clearings, broken spears half buried in the earth, an abandoned cart with a shattered wheel. But it was quiet now. The ravages of war had moved on, leaving behind a stillness that felt almost like a tomb. She moved like a stray cat, wary and silent. That evening, she reached a broader stream, too deep to wade easily. She walked along its bank, hoping to find a shallow crossing or some rocks she could hop across. Eventually, she found a fallen tree that bridged the stream. It was slick with moss, precarious, but it seemed passable. She tested it with her foot, wincing as it swayed slightly. She gritted her teeth, balanced her arms, and started across. The water rushed below, cold and dark. Halfway across, she slipped, one foot sliding on the moss. She yelped, arms flailing. Her heart lurched as she nearly tumbled off. But she managed to catch hold of a broken branch, steadying herself. She regained her balance, breathing heavily. Once she was sure she was stable, she inched forward again, more carefully, until she reached the other side. Safe. For a moment, she stood, trembling with adrenaline, telling herself she was fine. The sound of the rushing water was oddly comforting once the danger was past. She found a sheltered spot among the roots of a towering oak to make her night's camp. The air had grown chilly, and she cursed the approach of winter. She had only the clothes on her back, a thin cloak, and a small dagger. Sleep would not come easy if frost began to form. She considered a larger fire but decided against it. Better to remain hidden. She curled into herself and tried to conserve warmth. Her dreams were scattered. A face kept appearing to her, a face half-burned. She saw him standing by a fire, calling her name. But in her dream, he wasn't cursing her or threatening her. He stood there as if asking her to stay. When she woke, her cheeks were wet, though she wasn't sure if she'd been crying in her sleep or if the dew had settled on her face. At first light, she forced herself up. Her stomach rumbled in protest. She ate the last of the blackberries she had salvaged. Her fingers were stained purple. She pressed onward through the forest, searching for any sign of a path or a clearing. Now and again, she glimpsed distant hills through the breaks in the trees. She noted their shape, their position, trying to keep a sense of direction. She didn't dare light a smoky fire to signal any travelers. She didn't want to attract the wrong sort. By midday, fatigue set in. She told herself she had to find better shelter, maybe a place with a roof, or at least more game to hunt. She had some skill with snares, taught to her long ago by a boy in Winterfell's kitchens, but she hadn't the time to set them properly while constantly moving. Eventually, near a shallow gully, she spotted a sign of civilization. An old stone wall, half-collapsed, overgrown with vines. Following it, she discovered the remains of some ancient fort or watchtower. Most of the structure had toppled, but a corner of it still stood, forming a roofless chamber. The rubble and vines gave the impression that no one had cared for this place in generations. Stepping cautiously, she peered inside. The ground was littered with broken stone and rotting leaves. A rusted sword lay on the ground, snapped in two. Whose sword had it been? She walked a few paces further, finding a spot where the wall offered some cover from the wind. It was better than nothing. She decided to rest here for a while. She pulled away debris, trying to clear a small space for herself. A scurrying noise made her jump, some rodent or squirrel darting out from under the rubble. She took a moment to breathe, then collected bits of fallen wood in a corner, just in case she dared to light a fire later. Her eyes scanned the ground, noticing footprints. A chill prickled her neck. The footprints were old, partially washed away, but they might have been from more than one person. Could they still be around? She hesitated, listening. Only the whisper of wind in the trees responded. If someone had been here, they seemed long gone. She told herself she'd keep a watchful eye. She dozed for a short while, hunger gnawing at her insides. She dreamed of feasts in the great hall at Winterfell, of hot pies and roasted boar, of lemon cakes her sister used to savor. She woke with her stomach twisting painfully. Taking her dagger, she ventured around the old fort, hoping to find mushrooms or small game. There were tracks of rabbits in the soft ground, and she found droppings near some bushes. But she lacked a bow. She tried fashioning a snare with some twine in her pack, setting it among the rabbit tracks, hoping something might wander into it by dusk. Not wanting to stray too far from the fort, she returned and settled in, scanning the trees for any sign of pursuers. The day dragged on. She worried that the Hound might appear at any moment, that she might hear the thunder of his horse or the rustle of branches under heavy footsteps. But the forest remained quiet. She tried to practice the water-dancing moves Siriofarl had taught her. She imagined holding Needle, her lost sword, weaving it in slow arcs in the air. She pivoted, danced lightly on her toes, ignoring the pang of emptiness that came from remembering her time with Sirio. She repeated the motions until her limbs ached, then sank to the ground, her breath ragged. At least it gave her mind something to focus on besides the gnawing hunger and fear. Night arrived, and the moon rose in a slender arc, providing little light. She checked her snare but found it empty. Disappointment tightened her throat. She was so hungry now, she could almost hear her belly complaining loudly in the silence. She returned to the fort, rummaged through leaves, found a few bugs and worms, but she wasn't quite desperate enough for that yet. Instead, she decided to allow herself a small fire. She gathered the bits of wood, arranged them in the sheltered corner of the fort's remains. She struck sparks with her flint, coaxing a tiny flame to life. The warm glow danced on the broken stones, giving the ruin an eerie life. She fed the fire slowly, mindful of how little fuel she had. Once the flames were established, she lay close, letting the heat soak into her chilled bones. Her eyes drooped. In the flickering light, she caught sight of a shape among the stones. An old carving, possibly. She crawled closer to inspect it. It seemed to depict a wolf's head, though worn down by time. The sight made her heart twist. She thought of the sigil of House Stark, the dire wolf, of her father's presence in Winterfell, of the howling winds in the north. Tears threatened her, but she forced them back. She wouldn't cry. Not now. She drifted off eventually, lulled by the crackling fire. Her dreams were scattered images again. Her father, the Hound, her list of names, Lady Catelyn's voice. She heard a wolf howling far away. When she woke in a startled gasp, the fire was nearly out, just a glow of embers. Darkness pressed in. She thought she heard something moving outside. She grabbed her dagger, heart pounding, and crept to the broken wall. The moonlight revealed shifting silhouettes of tree branches, a breeze stirring them. She strained her ears. Could have been a deer or a fox, or a man, but nothing else stirred. Minutes passed. She decided it was likely just an animal. She returned to the dying embers, added one last piece of wood to keep a faint glow. She settled back, dagger at the ready, her mind whirling with suspicion and exhaustion. Eventually, she fell into a light sleep again. When dawn came, she forced herself to search the snare once more. Still empty. Cursing under her breath, she decided to move on. She might starve if she remained here, especially if there was little game to catch. Gathering her sparse belongings, she left the ruin behind. She followed a winding path between mossy rocks, forging deeper into a part of the forest that seemed even less traveled. The brush was thick, the terrain rocky. At times, she had to scramble on all fours. Her stomach cramped painfully. She would need food soon or risk collapsing. Late in the day, she emerged at the edge of the forest, onto a rolling slope. Below, a valley spread out, dotted with old farmland. She spied a narrow road in the distance, and maybe a cluster of huts. Relief mixed with worry. Where there were huts, there might be food, but also people. People could mean danger. Yet she had to risk it. Her legs were trembling, and she felt dizzy. If she didn't find something to eat, she wouldn't last much longer. She descended the slope, keeping to the cover of trees where possible, scanning for any signs of soldiers or bandits. The farmland looked neglected, the fields overgrown, fences broken. Near one cluster of huts, she spotted a single tendril of smoke rising. That meant someone was there, perhaps an old farmer or a family that refused to abandon their home. She inched closer, using a hedgerow for concealment, peering through the gaps. She saw a garden patch with what looked like wilted vegetables, a broken cart, and a man tending a thin goat. He was older, stooped, with a scraggly beard and clothing patched in multiple places. No sign of any others. Her stomach growled so loudly she worried he might hear it. She waited, watching him hobble around. Occasionally, he spoke to the goat, as though it were his only companion. She weighed her options. She could try to sneak into the hut, steal something. But if he caught her, what then? Would he raise an alarm, try to fight her off? He seemed frail, but desperation made people dangerous. Desperation also shaped her own decisions. She decided to approach cautiously, dagger hidden but ready. She crept from behind the hedgerow, stepping into the open. The old man's goat bleated, and he turned with a start, nearly dropping the bucket he carried. He squinted at her, clearly startled. "Who are you?" he demanded, voice shaky but with a hint of resolve. "What do you want?" Arya, heart hammering, forced herself to speak calmly. "I'm just a traveler. I'm hungry. I mean no harm." She kept her hands where he could see them, though her dagger remained tucked under her cloak. She tried to look pitiful, which wasn't difficult. She was starving, bedraggled, still just a thin young girl in appearance. The old man eyed her suspiciously. "Got nothing for thieves," he grumbled. "If you're after gold, you'll not find it." She shook her head. "I just want a little food. I can trade, or I can do some work." He raised a brow. "Work? What sort of work could a slip of a girl do?" "I can set snares, gather firewood, clean." She swallowed, trying to keep the desperation out of her voice. "I used to help in a big household." The lie came easily, though part of it was true from her time in Winterfell's hustle, not to mention her scattered experiences on the road. The man considered her. The goat bleated again, as though giving its opinion. Finally, he sighed. "Got some turnips, maybe a little leftover stew from last night. Not much else. If you want it, you can earn it by helping me mend a fence." "My back's not what it used to be." Relief washed over her. She nodded eagerly. "Yes, I can help." He motioned for her to follow. They walked to the small hut. The door hung crooked, but inside it was relatively clean, if sparse. A single table, a small hearth, a cot made of straw. Pot hung over cold embers. The old man scooped a ladle of stew into a wooden bowl and handed it to her. She took it with trembling hands, inhaling the aroma. It was thin, mostly watery, with chunks of turnip and a few bits of something that might have been meat at one point. She didn't ask what kind. She devoured it, the warmth filling her belly. He gave her a small slice of bread as well, almost moldy, but she didn't care. She could have wept with gratitude. When she finished, she followed him outside to the fence. It was just a rough wooden structure circling a patch of garden. Some boards had fallen, and the man had a small pile of spare planks. He showed her how to hold them in place while he hammered in nails, though his grip was weak. She offered to hammer instead, and after a suspicious glance, he let her. Together, they managed to make the fence somewhat sturdy again. He asked her name. She paused, uncertain which name to give. She'd used many, but finally, she said, "Arya," a simple answer. He grunted in acknowledgement, seemed not to care for more details. Night came, and he allowed her to sleep on the floor of the hut, near the hearth. She offered to stand watch, but he shook his head, saying he had no enemies here. He didn't seem to know how dangerous the roads had become. Or maybe he knew but had nothing worth stealing. Arya found herself drifting to sleep with a full belly for the first time in days. She felt almost safe, though she doubted safety was a thing one could truly have in these times. Come morning, she helped him with a few more chores, milking the goat, fetching water from a well. The old man seemed pleased enough. Over the simple breakfast of turnip mash, she braved a question. "Have you seen a man with a burned face pass by? Big, tall, rides a horse." The man frowned, shaking his head. "No travelers come this way for weeks. Raiders and bandits have scared folks off. Soldiers too. I mostly keep to myself." Arya nodded, feeling a strange swirl of relief and apprehension. Maybe the Hound wasn't close. Maybe she was free. After a brief pause, she asked another question. "Is there a town nearby? Or a place to find more work?" He pointed north. "Over the hill, down by the old river crossing, there's a town. Not much left of it. Soldiers burned half the huts. But some folks still live there. Maybe you'll find something." She considered staying longer, but she didn't want to burden the old man, nor did she fully trust him not to turn on her. She decided to move on. She thanked him. He offered her another bowl of stew for the road, which she gladly accepted, scarfing it down before she left. He didn't ask why she traveled alone, and she didn't volunteer answers. He seemed content with her silence. So she set off again, heading north toward the remnants of that town. The day was cool, a gentle breeze rustling the tall grass. Her stomach was no longer a twisting knot of pain, so she walked with more energy. She started thinking about what she would do once she reached that town. Could she find a blacksmith in need of an apprentice? Could she hide among the beggars, scrounging for coin until she saved enough to buy passage somewhere else? Her mind spun with possibilities. But at least now, the immediate dread of starvation had receded. She found a dirt road that led toward the crossing. It bore ruts from old wagons, and here and there she saw a broken arrow shaft or scraps of cloth. Evidence of war. The further she went, the more anxious she became. She had grown so used to the Hound's towering presence at her side that the emptiness of her shadow felt like a brand on her soul. She walked faster, scolding herself for missing him. It was a foolish, contradictory feeling. She should be glad to be free of him. She told herself that many times. So why did her thoughts keep drifting back to him? In that moment, as if conjured by her fear, she heard hooves. She froze, hand flying to her dagger. She looked around for a hiding spot, but the road was flanked by open fields. A small copse of trees stood 100 yards away, too far to sprint without being seen. The hooves grew louder. She clenched her teeth, heart pounding. Then, over the crest of the hill behind her, a rider appeared. She exhaled a shaky breath when she saw it wasn't the Hound. It was a thin man astride a bony mare, wearing mismatched armor. He had a short, ragged beard and weary eyes. He spotted her and slowed, calling out, "Ho there, girl!" Arya weighed her options. Run, or try to act normal. She forced her posture to relax. She raised a hand in greeting, though she kept her other hand near her dagger. The man approached at a slow trot, scanning her from head to toe. "You alone?" he asked. She nodded, uncertain if lying would help. "Just traveling," she said softly. He studied her a moment longer, then shrugged. Dangerous times to be on the road alone, especially for a young one. She shrugged, mimicking the casual indifference the Hound often displayed. "I manage," he sniffed. "I'm a sellsword, out of work, looking for a new lord to follow. There's no shortage of conflict, but not many paying wages anymore. Might be better to head east. Heard rumors that some houses are still hiring blades. But who knows?" Arya made a non-committal noise. She guessed he might want something from her, but he didn't seem overly interested in harming her at the moment. He squinted at the horizon. "Town ahead is mostly ruins," he said. "You won't find much there except old widows and burned-out husks. Bandits sometimes roam around. Be careful." He nudged his mare forward, then paused. "You sure you'll be fine?" She forced a tight smile. "I'll be fine." He shrugged again and rode on, leaving her in a swirl of dust. She watched him go, relieved he hadn't decided to rob or abduct her. Maybe her stoic demeanor had worked, or maybe he truly saw no profit in messing with one scrawny girl. Pressing on, she eventually reached the outskirts of the town. The place was nearly as derelict as the fort she'd found. Burned timbers, collapsed roofs, and blackened walls bore silent testimony to the violence that had passed through. A few huts still stood, but half of them looked abandoned. The others had makeshift repairs, boarded windows, patched roofs. She spied a woman gathering water from a well. A child with hollow eyes peeked from a doorway. With caution, she approached the well, stepping lightly as though on broken glass. The woman, middle-aged with lines of worry etched across her face, paused and eyed Arya with suspicion. Arya put on her most harmless expression. Could I have some water?" The woman clenched her jaw, but then relented and moved aside. Arya drew up a bucket, the rope squeaking. She cupped her hands in the flow, drank greedily. The water was fresh, cold. She tried not to look as desperate as she felt. When she finished, she thanked the woman, who merely nodded once and turned away. Arya glanced around, noticing a small shrine at the edge of the square. The sign of the seven was half-burned, tilted askew, another sign of how war had touched every corner of this land. She saw a man sitting by a broken cart, whittling a piece of wood. She considered asking about work, but something in his stance told her he wouldn't be helpful. She moved on, rummaging in the remains of what might have once been a small marketplace. The stalls were charred, only fragments of wares scattered about. She found a bent spoon, a broken spool of thread. Nothing useful. She left them. After an hour of searching, she felt more and more certain that this place had been bled dry. She learned from a frightened old woman that bandits passed through occasionally, taking whatever scraps the townsfolk managed to gather. The woman begged Arya not to attract their attention, as if Arya had any power to stop them. Feeling helpless, Arya considered continuing north. But maybe she could stay a night here, see if any opportunity arose. She found a corner of a partially collapsed building that offered some shelter. She hoped no one would mind or notice. She tucked herself in, ignoring the grime, and tried to rest. Her mind drifted. She recalled all the times she and the Hound had stayed in rickety inns or under the stars, how he'd grumble about fleas and the smell of horse dung. In those small, shared miseries, they'd found an odd sort of camaraderie. She realized she missed having someone to share the burden of surviving. She hated herself for thinking it. Late in the afternoon, she decided she'd try to find food. She asked a skinny boy where she might buy or trade for something. He merely pointed to a hut at the far end of the row. Arya approached, uncertain. She rapped on the door. No answer. She tried again, hearing movement inside. A man's voice growled, "Go away. Got nothing for you." She persisted, saying she had a bit of coin, that she only wanted a loaf of bread or some dried meat. After a pause, the door creaked open, revealing a haggard man in tattered clothes. He looked her up and down. "Coin, you say?" he asked, narrowing his eyes. She nodded, swallowing. "A little." He scratched his stubbly chin. "Show it." Her gut warned her this could be a trap, but she needed to eat. She reached into her pouch, pulled out a couple of battered copper coins. He snorted. "That's all? You'll not get much, but maybe I got a bit of stale bread. Wait here." He closed the door. Minutes later, he returned and handed her a hard, blackened crust that might once have been bread. "That's it," he said. "Now off with you." She exchanged the coins for the bread and walked away, heart sinking at how meager it was. But it would have to do. She sank her teeth into it, nearly chipping a tooth. Chewing was a labor, but it eased her hunger a bit. She found a place to sit, nibbling at the edges. The sky was beginning to darken. She noticed the boy she had asked for directions lurking nearby. She offered him a small piece of the crust, and he grabbed it hungrily, devouring it. He seemed too shy or wary to speak, but she caught the gratitude in his eyes. As night fell, the scattered inhabitants retreated into their huts, latching doors and shuttering windows. The air held a quiet tension, as though expecting trouble. Arya returned to her corner in the collapsed building, drew her cloak around her. She tried to sleep, but her ears remained attuned to every noise. A scuff of a foot, a distant door creaking, the wind stirring debris. Sometime past midnight, a new sound intruded. Hoofbeats. She jolted upright, her breath caught in her throat. She peered through a gap in the broken wall, seeing torchlight flicker on the far side of the street. A handful of riders entered the town. Their voices carried low in the stillness. She counted at least 3, possibly more. They dismounted near the well. She heard a man shout, "Where's everyone? Don't hide, we come for taxes and tribute. Show yourselves." The rest of them laughed cruelly. Clearly, they were no honest knights. Probably the bandits the old woman mentioned. Arya's pulse thudded. She shrank back, hoping they wouldn't search the ruins thoroughly. She had no illusions about what they might do if they found her. The voices carried, a few men barking orders at the cowering townsfolk. Someone whimpered, Then came the sound of a scuffle, a blow, a cry of pain. Arya clutched her dagger. She yearned to help, but how could she stand against multiple armed men? She was just one starving girl with a single blade. They forced open the door of the haggard man's hut, and she heard shouts, the sound of something smashing. More screams, then the crackle of flames. She watched in horror as the bandits set at least one hut alight. Villagers ran, trying to extinguish the fire, pleading for mercy. The men only laughed. Arya's heart hammered in her chest, her grip on the dagger white-knuckled. She had to leave, to slip away before they torched everything or discovered her. But part of her raged at the injustice. She remembered how the Hound might charge in, sword drawn, cursing at the top of his lungs, striking them down. Or how her father, if he were alive, would have tried to protect these small folk. But she was not the Hound, and her father was dead. Nevertheless, a part of her refused to do nothing. She crawled out from the rubble, careful to stay in the shadows. The bandits were focused on the huts, rummaging for valuables. A few villagers huddled behind a broken cart, fear etched on their faces. Arya slipped across the street, crouching low. One of the riders had dismounted to root around near the blacksmith's shack. He was alone. She tested the weight of her dagger in her hand, considering. If she killed him swiftly, would the others notice? A scream pierced the night from the far side of the square. Another bandit must have found something or someone. Arya forced herself to remain calm, scanning the positions of the raiders. She counted 4, all armed with swords or axes. Taking them on directly would be suicide, but maybe she could pick them off one by one if luck favored her. Or maybe this was a fool's errand. She almost turned away, telling herself she wasn't a hero. Then she remembered the boy's hollow eyes, the old woman who gave her water. A spark of anger blazed in her chest. She crept around the back of the blacksmith's shack, quiet as a cat. The bandit rummaging there was cursing about the lack of loot, his torchlight swinging wildly. She waited until his back was turned, then lunged, driving her dagger toward the gap in his armor near his side. But her aim, fueled by desperation, went awry. She grazed his armor instead, sending a scraping sound into the night. He yelped in surprise, spinning around, torchlight illuminating Arya's stunned face. He roared, raising a short sword. She barely dodged the swing, stumbling backward. Her mind raced. She was outmatched. She quickly scrambled to the side, trying to circle. He advanced, shouting curses, calling for his companions. Arya realized she had seconds before the others arrived. Gathering what courage she had, she feinted to the left, then darted right, slashing at his thigh. Her blade cut flesh this time, making him roar in pain. He brought his sword down, and she deflected it with her dagger, the impact jarring her arm. She was no match in strength, so she tried to dance around him, seeking a vital opening. But he was larger, older, more experienced. He kicked her in the midsection, sending her crashing to the ground. Her breath whooshed out. Torchlight flickered across his snarling face as he lifted his sword to strike. Then, in the chaos, something happened. A massive shape barreled into the bandit from the side, knocking him away from Arya. It was a horse, she realized, rearing up, hoofs flailing. The bandit dropped the torch and stumbled back. Arya rolled to the side, gasping for air. A voice growled above the din. "Stupid girl. Always in trouble." It was him, Sandor Clegane, the Hound. He swung a blade, striking the bandit's sword aside. Before the bandit could recover, the Hound drove his steel into the man's chest, dropping him in a spray of blood. The dying man collapsed, eyes wide with shock. Arya stared in stunned disbelief. The Hound turned his scarred face toward her, eyes burning. "Get up!" he snarled, hand outstretched. She hesitated, heart pounding. But there was no time to argue. Another bandit was running toward them, alerted by the commotion. The Hound whirled, meeting the attacker with a roar, steel clashing on steel. Arya scrambled to her feet, picking up her dagger. She felt a strange surge of relief and fury at once. The bandit swung an axe at the Hound, but he sidestepped with surprising agility, then countered with a brutal slash that bit deep into the man's neck. Blood sprayed and the bandit crumpled. Arya heard other shouts in the distance. The remaining two were engaged elsewhere, perhaps with the villagers. The Hound turned to Arya, his lips twisted in anger. "Run or fight, but do it now." She nodded, adrenaline surging. She ran around the shack, scanning for the other threats. She saw one bandit near the well, dragging a terrified villager by the hair. Another bandit rummaged in a hut, torch in hand. She signaled to the Hound, and he shot her a glare that said, "Stay back," but she ignored it, charging toward the bandit by the well. The Hound cursed and followed her. The bandit raised his sword at Arya's approach, releasing the villager to face this new threat. She fainted, and the Hound crashed in from behind, smashing the man's helmet with the hilt of his sword. The bandit staggered, and Arya slashed at his exposed neck. Her blade found a gap, and he went down, gurgling. The villagers scrambled away, eyes wide in horror. The last bandit, seeing his companions fall, tried to flee on horseback, but the Hound bellowed, charging forward. He grabbed the man's leg, yanking him off the horse. They struggled briefly in the dirt, but the Hound's superior strength prevailed. He plunged his blade down, ending the man with a guttural grunt. Silence fell, broken only by the crackling of a small fire that still lingered on one hut's thatched roof. The Hound stood there, breathing heavily, blood spattering his armor. He glared at Arya, who hovered nearby, dagger still clenched in her hand. The villagers that had not fled stared in stunned disbelief. Finally, the Hound spat on the ground and rounded on her. "Thought you were clever, leaving me in the night like that?" She opened her mouth to reply, but words failed her. He let out a harsh laugh. "You're a fool. You think I wouldn't track you? You think I'd let you wander off to get yourself killed by the first band of cutthroats you came across?" His voice shook with anger or something close to it. "No thanks to you. I've spent days following your damned footprints, asking questions in stinking villages, worried I'd find you dead in a ditch." Arya's heart pounded, a tangled knot of guilt, anger, and relief swirling within her. She forced herself to meet his eyes. "I don't belong to you," she spat, though her voice shook. He snorted, took a threatening step forward. She tensed, but he stopped short, looking exhausted. "You belong to no one but yourself," he muttered. "But you're too stubborn to see it's better to have someone watch your back in times like these." Villagers began to creep out of hiding, eyeing the Hound warily. He growled at them to mind their own business, and they did, turning their attention to putting out the small fire and tending the wounded. One approached the Hound with hesitant gratitude. "Thank you for killing those devils." The Hound bared his teeth in a grimace that might have been a smirk. "Don't thank me. I didn't do it for you." But he didn't stop the man from bowing his head in thanks anyway. Arya felt a rush of dizziness. She realized she was trembling all over. The events of the night pressed on her like a physical weight. The Hound noticed, reached out as if to steady her, then let his hand fall. Instead, he jerked his head. "Come on, we're leaving." She stared, uncertainty flickering across her face. But where else was she to go? She looked at the villagers, their haunted eyes, their burned huts. She knew she couldn't stay here. With a bitter resignation, she nodded. Together, they retrieved the Hound's horse, which was nervously stomping near the blacksmith's shack. Arya climbed onto it behind him. He didn't speak again as they trotted out of the ruined town. The villagers watched them go, some with silent gratitude, others with distrust. The road stretched before them in the moonlight. They rode in tense silence, broken only by the horses' labored breathing. Finally, after they'd put some distance behind them, Arya mustered the courage to speak. "You saved me," she said, her tone quiet. He huffed. "Don't let it go to your head." They lapsed into silence again. Beneath the mild moonlight, the forest loomed ahead. She clung to him, her hands around his waist, uncertain if this was relief or regret she felt. A thought sprang to mind. She'd left him once, thinking she could manage on her own, and nearly died tonight because of it. Yet, being with him carried its own dangers and uncertainties. She closed her eyes, leaning her forehead against his back, feeling the rough texture of his armor. She couldn't see where the road would take them next, but for now she was alive. And he was there, a hulking presence of both dread and strange comfort. They rode through the night, saying little. The Hound's posture was tense, as though he might still be waiting for a scolding or an apology. Arya offered neither. She felt too raw for words. Eventually, they found a spot near a brook to make camp. He dismounted stiffly, ignoring the protesting brambles that caught at his boots. Arya slid off the horse, keeping her distance. She couldn't shake the sense that she'd stepped back into a world she'd tried to escape, and perhaps needed after all. He gathered some branches for a small fire, rummaging in his saddlebags for dried meat. She lingered a few steps away, arms folded, unable to fully look at him. After a moment, he tossed her a scrap of jerky. She caught it and, without thanks, began gnawing on it. They were both exhausted, physically and emotionally. At length, he muttered, "Don't try that again." She bristled. "I do what I please." His scarred face flickered with annoyance in the firelight. "You'll please yourself into a grave. This world isn't kind to lone wolves, especially not pups like you." Arya felt a flash of anger. "I'm not a pup," he exhaled, long and weary. "You're a Stark of Winterfell, or so you keep reminding me when it suits you. Either way, you're not meant to run alone. Not yet." She tore at the jerky with her teeth, saying nothing. The night deepened, the sky peppered with stars. She thought of her family, scattered and lost. She thought of the old man who gave her stew, of the bandits lying dead in that town. She thought of the scorn in the Hound's eyes, the frustration in his voice. And she thought of the strange sense of safety she felt, however briefly, now that he was near again. The Hound lay down, cradling his sword in the crook of his arm, as was his habit. Arya curled up nearby, one hand still on her dagger. She stared into the flickering flames, listening to the quiet crackle of burning wood. The hush of the forest enveloped them. The past days felt like a long, futile dream. Here she was again, side by side with the man who was both captor and savior, teacher and tormentor. As the moon arced overhead, she realized that leaving him had only delayed the inevitable choice she had to make, about who she wanted to be and how she wanted to survive in this cruel land. The Hound might not be her friend, but he was no simple enemy either. He was something else, something that defied the categories of her old life. For tonight, at least, she would rest. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. And so the forest, the world, and the two unlikely companions held their breath under the cold stars, locked in a fragile alliance that neither truly understood, but both somehow needed. For a moment, Arya Stark allowed herself to be grateful she wasn't alone in the dark. And the Hound, though he'd never say it, took a weary satisfaction in knowing the girl was still alive by his side, at least for now.